When you think of King Henry VIII, you are met with thoughts of brutality and ruthlessness. He was a man who stopped at nothing to get his own way, and would beat down anyone who got in his path. Henry had 6 wives, and we have all heard the saying, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But who was number 5 in that scenario? Catherine Howard was a young teenage girl. She married the king because he was completely infatuated with her, and her terrible past filled with abuse and scandal would catch up to her, causing her death and untimely execution. But who was this young girl, and why did she end up in the jaws of the wretched king, a king who was ultimately 30 years older than she was, and the man who led her to the executioner's block for adultery in the Tower of London? There are very few records documenting Catherine Howard's early life, and the few that do remain place her date of birth somewhere between 1518 and 1524, but the general consensus was that she was born closer to 1524. She was part of a powerful family known as the Howards, but a smaller branch with little fortune. Her father was Anne Boleyn's mother's brother, and this made Catherine and Anne first cousins. She was also related to Jane Seymour, Henry's 3rd wife, as Catherine and Jane's grandmothers were sisters. Catherine had multiple siblings and half-siblings. You see, her mother Joyce had around 10 children, 5 from her first marriage and then 5 from her second. Catherine Howard was the niece of the Duke of Norfolk, and he was one of the most powerful men in England at the time. Edmund Howard, his brother, her father, married Joyce or Jocasta, and she was the daughter of Sir Richard Culpepper. Catherine came from fine stock, and her family's connections spread far and wide. As such, when Catherine's mother died, when Catherine was just young, she was moved to live with her step-grandmother, Agnes Tilney, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. Catherine was given a fairly good education at the time, and she was raised as a Catholic, but the education and faith imposed on her did not help her when she encountered issues. You see, Catherine was also taught by a young music teacher. He is believed to have been at least twice her age, and Catherine at the time was as young as 12. Henry Manox took advantage of the young girl, sexual advantage, but it's claimed they did not have intercourse. The Duchess caught the pair embracing, and she struck Catherine. She struck down the child when it was the older man in a position of trust taking advantage, and it was the dowager's fault for not safeguarding her honour as custom dictated. You would have hoped that this was the first and last time that Catherine found herself in a situation, but it wasn't. When she was around 14, so just 2 years later, she found herself sexually involved with a man called Francis Derham. The family had recently moved from Chesworth House in Sussex to Lambeth in London. Derham had been appointed the secretary to her grandmother. There was no doubt that this relationship was full-blown sexual relations, and they even referred to each other as husband and wife, something that would cause havoc in the years following. Now, according to the later testimony of one of Catherine's roommates, there was much panting and puffing in the communal bedchamber, and that they were forever hanging together by the belly like sparrows. Catherine herself later admitted that she knew how to meddle with a man without conceiving a child, which suggested that she was sexually experienced. It is believed that Catherine was very beautiful, although a French ambassador referred to her as short and graceful instead, but there was no doubt that she was very attractive. There are not any confirmed portraits of Catherine to confirm this, but the consensus remained. Then, Catherine, in the year of 1539, around March, at the age of 15, was entered into the up-and-coming household of Anne of Cleves, the fourth wife of Henry VIII. Catherine's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, had made this possible. Catherine then, in the December of the same year, met the king. He was travelling to await the arrival of his new wife, Anne, at Greenwich, and it's believed that after the disastrous first meeting between the king and his wife, that Norfolk pushed Catherine purposely into the king's path. And then, by the following June, Henry's interest in Catherine was widespread news through court. One observer noted that the king crept too near another lady, and Anne of Cleves herself complained that her new husband was attracted to Catherine. It's believed that Henry saw Catherine as his long-lost youth, and his new love interest was his way of recapturing it. He then secured his annulment with Anne of Cleves on the 12th of July, 1540, and by the 28th of the same month, Catherine and the king married. On this very same day, Thomas Cromwell was executed, and then on the 8th of August, Catherine was formally acknowledged as Queen at Hampton Court Palace. Now, sadly, Catherine was then proven to have little free will. She was now the wife and queen of Henry VIII. She adopted the motto, non autre volonté que la sienne, meaning, no other will but his. Catherine, as a queen, appeared to be gracious and conventional. She was warm and friendly, especially to Anne of Cleves, her predecessor. They exchanged gifts and danced together at her first court Christmas. Catherine is also thought to have pleaded successfully with her husband to pardon some prisoners. But the attraction that Henry VIII felt towards Catherine was so very obvious. The king is so amorous of her that he cannot treat her well enough and caresses her more than he did the others, reported the scandalised French ambassador. Now, being the wife of Henry VIII not only came with being queen, but also with being a stepmother to his children. Catherine and Mary did not get along. Mary was older than she, and this must have caused a significant amount of upset for both parties. But Catherine did get along with Elizabeth and Edward. With Elizabeth she found family, as the pair were related, and as such Catherine gifted the young princess jewels. In terms of her own children, there was one rumour that filled the court in the April of 1541, but either Catherine lost the child, or it was rumours, and I think personally it was just that, rumours, because the king at this point was thought to be impotent, so the prospects of children was quite minimal, if any. But then the veil lifted, and it was obvious that Catherine disregarded how she was required to behave as queen and wife of the king, and it became very obvious. And just a few short months after becoming queen, Francis Derham showed up at court and demanded that she gave him office, and he boasted to the councillors that she favoured him. It was around the same time that Catherine and Thomas Culpepper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, began exchanging favours. It is interesting to point out that Catherine and Culpepper were distantly related through her mother, and that Culpepper is noted as being a sexual predator. He was described as a beautiful youth, but it's believed that he had a gnarly past that included rape and murder, crimes that he got away with due to the favour he held with the king. It's not known if this was known to Catherine, but regardless, Culpepper and Catherine began an affair just before the king's 50th birthday. The young queen accompanied the king on his summer tour of the country, and Culpepper went with them. It's believed that later testimony stated that when the court travelled, the pair would have illicit meetings. These meetings are thought to have been enabled and facilitated by Catherine's lady-in-waiting, Jane Boleyn, the sister-in-law to Anne Boleyn. Catherine then sadly sealed her fate with a letter. She wrote in this letter to Culpepper that "it makes my heart die to think I cannot be always in your company." She then signed the letter, "Yours as long as life endures." But newer research suggests that this letter was an example of a young girl trying to please an aggressive, dangerous suitor, and not some love-fueled sexual desire. Now, regardless of its true meaning, this is the letter that sent Catherine to the chopping block. Thomas Culpepper, it's believed, may have established a threatening control over the young queen, and that she may not have been a willing participant. It is also believed that Catherine had very little say in any of her relationships, including the one with the king. Catherine then even gave in to the demand of Francis Dereham and made him her secretary. Catherine's past was quickly catching up to her, and her current actions were fueling rumours which reached the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer was informed of Catherine's past liaisons by a former member of her childhood home, and he was then given the task of telling the king. Now, what is interesting is that Thomas Cranmer never approved of the marriage between Catherine and Henry, not because he disliked Catherine, but because of her grandfather, Thomas Howard, who was a strong opponent of his. Cranmer was informed by a man called John Lascelles that his sister, Mary Hall, used to work in the household of Catherine when she was just a teenager, and that Catherine had fornicated with Henry Manox, Francis Dereham, and Thomas Culpepper. Cranmer must have seen this as an opportunity to discredit any support of Catherine, and with Catherine out of the way, he could then suggest the name of a bride who, like Anne Boleyn, would favour religious reform. During Cranmer's investigations, he spoke with Mary Hall, the woman who worked in Catherine's household, and she told him about Catherine being in a relationship with Manox in 1536. She said that she had gone to see Manox to warn him of his behaviour, and he said the following: "Hold thy peace, woman, I know her well enough. My designs are of a dishonest kind, and from the liberties the young lady has allowed me, I doubt not of being able to elect my purpose. She hath said to me that I shall have her maidenhead, though it be painful to her, no doubting but I will be good to her hereafter." Mary then claimed that for 100 nights or more Francis Dereham had crept into the lady's dormitory and climbed, dressed in a doublet and hose, into Catherine's bed. Sir Thomas Cranmer then wrote a detailed summary and left it in the chapel at Hampton Court for the king to find and read. Now, initially, Henry acted with total disbelief. He felt the accusations had no truth behind them, but nevertheless, Henry still ensured that an investigation was had and that Cranmer looked into the matters more thoroughly. "You are not to desist until you have got to the bottom of the plot." Henry told Thomas Wriothesley that he could not believe it to be true, and yet, the accusation having once been made, he could be satisfied till the certainty hereof was known. But he could not, in any wise, that in the Inquisition any spark of scandal should arise against the Queen. Henry initially gave the order that Catherine was to be confined to her apartments with just Jane Boleyn in attendance. It's thought, as reported by Eustace Chapuis, that Catherine refused to eat or drink anything, and she did not cease from weeping or crying like a mad woman, so much that they must take things away by which she might hasten her death. Henry was in shock, and he was in utter disbelief that his wife was capable of these things. He ordered an immediate inquiry, and this proved the allegations to be true, as well as uncovering more. As stated, Jane Boleyn was proven to have facilitated the meetings between Culpepper and Catherine, and she was then interrogated and confessed as such. Now, Catherine herself confessed on the 8th of November. She said that Francis Dereham had used her in such sort as a man doth use his wife many and sundry times. She also confessed to having had an affair with Culpepper, and having had sexual encounters with Henry Manox. Catherine is noted by Cranmer when reporting her testimony that she was in a state of lamentation and heaviness, as I never saw no creature. Now, unable to get much sense out of the Queen, he returned the following day. He told her that if she made a full confession, the King would probably show mercy. She eventually confessed that Francis Derham called her wife, and that she used the term husband, and that it was common gossip in the household that they would marry. He had many times moved me unto the question of matrimony, but she refused all his proposals. This is where Catherine made a serious mistake with the confession. Under the law of the time, if she had made a pre-contract of marriage with Derham, her marriage to Henry would have been invalid, and therefore she could not have been convicted of adultery. Catherine claimed that Francis Derham, the man claiming to be her former lover, had actually raped her, and that there was no pre-contract of marriage, but her pleas and her words were of no use, because then on the 23rd of November, Catherine was stripped of her title as Queen. Queen Catherine admitted that she had on many occasions gone to bed with Derham. He hath lain with me, sometimes in his doublet and hose, and 2 or 3 times naked, but not so naked that he had nothing upon him, for he had always at the least his doublet, and as I do think his hose also, but I mean naked, when his hose was put down. Catherine claimed she had not willingly had sexual intercourse with Derham, and that he had raped her with importunate force. Catherine was then questioned about Thomas Culpepper. Cranmer told her that he had heard a rumour they were romantically involved and about to marry. Catherine replied, "What should you trouble me therefore about, for you know I will not have you. And if you heard such report, you know more than I." Cranmer was searching for someone who had committed adultery with the Queen, and Thomas Culpepper was to be arrested and questioned. Now, it's interesting to note that when Henry VIII was confronted with his young wife's past, he spiralled into a deep depression, something it's thought he never recovered from. He said that he had no idea about her past and her infidelity. Catherine was moved from Hampton Court to the former monastery of Sion, and 8 days later was deprived of queenship. Manox, Culpepper and Derham were all questioned, but only Culpepper and Derham were convicted of treason on December 1st. They were shortly afterwards executed at Tyburn. Culpepper was beheaded, and Derham was hanged, drawn and quartered. Then Catherine and Lady Rochford, Jane Boleyn, were condemned under a bill of attainder on January 21st, 1542. The bill stated that any future queen who did not disclose her unchaste past would be guilty of treason. This law affected the next queen, Catherine Parr, who was required to disclose her past marriages. Now, Catherine must have known her time would be sometimes up soon, as especially Thomas Culpepper and another man, Francis Derham, had been condemned for their involvement. As stated, the pair were executed, and then their heads were placed above London Bridge as traitors, and Catherine may have even passed under the heads of her former lovers as she made her way by barge to the Tower of London, where she then went through Traitors' Gate. It's said that Henry would have forgiven Catherine for her premarital activities, but the fact that Culpepper confessed and Catherine's dirty laundry was now hanging for the world to see made his thoughts of mercy turn to rage, and poor Catherine did not stand a chance. It was then, at 7 a.m. on the 13th of February 1542, that Catherine Howard was to be executed, and she spent the night before practising how to lay her head upon the executioner's block so that her death could be without issue or problems and would be over as quickly as possible. Anyone who was sentenced to death in this way hoped that their execution would be in one swift strike of the axe. And let's remember, she was just a teenage girl, some say as young as 18 or 19, when she was preparing for her death. The executioner did not make a mess of her execution, and in one swift blow he took the head off of Henry VIII's 5th wife, and the blood of her spilled out all over the scaffold. Catherine was said to have stated that she deserved to die 1,000 deaths for the betrayal of her husband the king, and it is also rumoured, but unlikely, that she also said, "I'd die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpepper." Now after Catherine, Jane Boleyn was also swiftly executed, kneeling in the blood of her former queen. Catherine's remains were then collected and swiftly taken to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, as were the remains of Jane. The remains were then thrown into a roughly dug grave or hole under the floor of the chapel. Catherine's body, once in her grave, was then, under the instruction of Henry VIII, doused in a very large amount of quicklime. The aim? To completely rid her from this earthly plane, as if she had never existed. The effects of this would be a lot quicker than normal decomposition. The remains of Catherine, as well as the cloth, would have decayed and rotted, and then the king would have had his wish that very little of her would be left on this earth. He did not want her remembered. He did not want any grave for her. Henry VIII wanted to forget the scandal of his 5th wife. However, during the reign of Queen Victoria, the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, inside the Tower of London, had a significant amount of restoration and repair work done to it, as Victoria did not believe the chapel was fit enough to house the remains of queens, these being Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and Lady Jane Grey. The builders and specialists worked together, and they dug up the bodies of a number of prominent people who were executed inside the Tower of London. Some of these figures had been executed on Tower Hill, and their remains had then been brought into the chapel to be buried. A large amount of bones had been deposited inside of the crypt, but the remains of Jane Boleyn, who helped the Queen cheat on the King, were found. But then there was a significant problem. The archaeologists and specialists managed to find the remains of many people who were identified. This included Anne Boleyn, the King's 2nd wife. But because of Catherine's significance, there was a search carried out near to the high altar, but they could not find her body or skeleton. A small collection of bones, which had been strongly affected by the presence of quicklime, were discovered close to the body of Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, another victim of Henry VIII, and these bones were attributed to have possibly belonged to the King's 5th wife, Catherine Howard, but there was never any DNA testing or any form of investigation which detailed exactly who these came from. If this investigation would have occurred, then the parts of the body could have been at least dated and attributed to either male or female. They could have also worked out roughly an age of the person who these belonged to, meaning there would have been a better chance these may have belonged to Howard. Much of her remains had gone, but this was something, a small part of the young queen who married the most tyrannical king England had ever seen, and she deserved so much better, as she had been attributed today to have been more of an abused child than a plotting witch than she has been portrayed in the past. Today we remember Catherine Howard, and it's sad to think that she was just a child who fell into the hands of men who used and abused her with no protection from her guardians. She found herself in a situation she could not get out of, and ultimately met her death on the executioner's scaffold within the walls of the Tower of London on Tower Green. Today the remains and body of Catherine Howard remain lost. Her body and skeleton have never been officially found, leading to the conclusion that Henry VIII got what he wanted, and that she was literally erased off the face of the earth upon his orders to dump copious amounts of quicklime on her. There is a memorial stone today inside the chapel, and many believe that this is a grave marker to the 5th wife of the Tudor king. However, this is not the case, and there is simply no body that exists under the marker. One theory is that because of her age as a teenager when she was executed, that her bones had not hardened as they would have done if she was into her full adulthood, meaning the lime would have got rid of her bones quicker. But Catherine Howard was a young girl who may have been led astray by one of the king's courtiers who had heard about her talents in the bedroom that the king preached about, and in the form of Thomas Culpepper, Catherine may have had a lot more in common with him rather than her large and huge husband. She had a horrific life and was led astray a number of times throughout her short time on the earth. But the treatment of her in her death and what happened to her remains after her execution was horrific, and Catherine Howard, the fifth wife of Henry VIII, was quite literally made to disappear, and nothing except the possible small collection of remains, which may be her, exist. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.